Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar on family violence. I'm Jo Flanagan and I'm the CEO of Women's Health Tasmania. This is the first of two webinars we're delivering with the Women's Legal Service of Tasmania, and it's taking place across the lands of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community all across Tasmania. So we want to acknowledge and pay respect to them as the traditional and original owners of Lutruwita. We'd also like to acknowledge and extend our respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be in the audience today. So our webinar today aims to provide you with information to help you to identify the behaviours that constitute family violence and also give you information about the legal framework for responding to family violence situations. Our speaker, Elise, is happy to answer questions from you as we go while the webinar is underway. So please use the Q&A function, which is on the little the box at the bottom of your screen. And the questions will go directly to her. No one will see your name and she can respond to your questions. We know everyone's on their lunch break, so we'll aim to finish on time. So just to let you know, a recording of this and Elise's slides will be available on our website early next week. So now I'd like to introduce Elise, our speaker. Elise is a senior practitioner with the Tasmanian Women's Legal Service, and she works mainly in domestic violence units in the North of Tasmania. She's worked across numerous community legal centres over the past decade and practices in the areas of family law and family violence, as well as discrimination, employment and sexual harassment law. It's lovely to have you here, Elise, and I'm going to hand the webinar over to you.
Great, thank you, Jo, and thanks for having me. The first thing I might do is try and share my screen, which we had a practice run through with before, and hopefully you might now be able to see my screen. Can I perhaps just get someone to jump into the chat and just give me a heads up that they can see the screen? Wonderful, thank you. Okay, great. I really love the chat function. So as we go through this afternoon, I might just ask a few questions and for a little bit of feedback. Just nice to know that I'm not sitting here talking to myself. So if you feel comfortable, I'm very happy for you to pop into the chat and respond to questions that I ask. But again, if you want to stay anonymous, the Q&A function will also be available to me and I'll be able to see questions as they come through. Okay. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. So I am on the land of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, Lutruwita, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and those present in our viewing our webinar today. Okay, so we've got an hour, a little bit less this afternoon, and I'm going to try and touch on three main things. So firstly, I want to start talking just about healthy and unhealthy relationships and maybe some differences between an unhealthy relationship and where it can become abusive. We'll then move on to look at the specifics of what constitutes family violence under the Tasmanian legislation, and then finish up with some red flags, and I will touch on some protective orders that can be put in place as well. Just really quickly, a little bit about who we are. So we're a community legal centre in Tasmania. We have offices in Hobart, Launceston and Burnie, and we can provide free and confidential information on a range of legal subjects. Generally, our casework is in the areas of family violence, family law and child safety. But if you need to contact us, our information will be at the end of these slides. The other thing that I will just quickly draw your attention to is our Rule of Thumb podcast. So if you want some more information about the types of things I'm going to be talking about today, season 2 of our podcast Rule of Thumb goes through the different types of family violence and different ways that you might be able to respond to it if you see it or if you suspect it in family members or friends or within the people that you work with. Okay, so this is going to be your turn. So if you feel comfortable and if you would like to jump into the chat, could you give me some examples of things that you think are healthy relationships or some attributes of healthy relationships? So what might you be looking for? Yep, respectful. It's a great place to start. Mutual respect. Thank you. Good communication. Yep. Trust. Yep. Communication. Listening. Yep. So we're sort of on theme here. So yeah, clear boundaries. I love that one. Psychological and physical safety. Beautiful. Complementary, negotiation. Yep. So when we're looking at healthy relationships, there can be that you've all probably got lots of different types of relationships in your life. So they can be with intimate partners, with siblings, parents, children, colleagues, allowing individual agency. Yep, really like that one as well. Okay, so when you think of an unhealthy relationship, bringing to mind that there are different types of relationships, what are some of the things that you might think of when you think of an unhealthy relationship? What are some characteristics that we might look out for? Codependency, yeah. Manipulation, no boundaries, fear and intimidation. One or more people feeling like they aren't being heard, yep. Okay, power imbalance, yes. Coercion, yep. All right, you folks are on point. All right, so thank you for that. That's just sort of setting the stage for what we're going to move into next. But before we do that, I might just draw your attention to the fact that when I talk about family violence, I do look at it through a bit of a gendered lens. I do acknowledge that family violence can be perpetrated by women and that men can experience it. However, when we're looking at the numbers, we do find that disproportionately it is an issue that impacts women. And my experience working at the Women's Legal Service tends to see women as the victim survivors of family violence and men as the perpetrators or the people who use violence in their relationships. So I can sometimes default to saying he and she, but I do just want to clarify that I do understand that there are different genders and there are different gender dynamics in relationships. It's just a little bit of a shortcut that I use sometimes when I'm speaking about family violence. Okay, so what do I mean when I talk about family violence? Well, to start with, in Tasmania, we are dealing with significant relationships or spouses. So there are other jurisdictions where family violence includes family relationships like siblings, children, and other members of your family. In Tasmania, we only call it family violence under the law if it is between intimate partners and it is covered by either being married or being in a significant relationship with someone. That can cause a whole other question of whether the relationship was a significant relationship, and I will try not to get too bogged down in that. If there are questions about whether the relationship would constitute a significant relationship under law, probably best to get some legal advice about the circumstances there. All right, so I guess one of the main things that people think about when they think about family violence are the physical forms of family violence. So assault and abuse. So we're talking, kicking, punching, slapping, pulling hair, grabbing at someone's arm, preventing them from leaving a room. It does also include sexual assault and sexual abuse. And I understand that they are the types of things that come to mind. However, it's only one form of violence that can be used as family violence in a relationship. So moving down that list, we also have things like threats and coercion, intimidation and verbal abuse. So the types of threats that we might see, I'm thinking of women who say that they've been threatened that if they leave, they'll never see the kids again, or they won't get anything from a property settlement, or that if you go out with your friends at a particular event that you'd like to go to, there are threats of what can happen if you don't stay home with the perpetrator or with the children. coercing people into doing things that they don't want to, so intimidation, so making people feel that they don't have freedom of choice in their relationships, that they have to comply with the wishes of the perpetrator. Verbal abuse are things like calling people. I hear a lot of women who are mothers who say that their mothering or their parenting techniques are constantly called into question. A lot of sexual connotation with the verbal abuse, calling their partners sluts or whores, or high levels of jealousy, comment on weight, physical appearance. So these are all really common things that I see with the women that I speak to about the type of verbal abuse that they're subjected to. So moving through that list, abduction, not especially common, but I have seen it in circumstances where you might be driving with a partner who won't stop the car to let you out, or will be taking you somewhere and you've got no way to remove yourself from that situation. Stalking and bullying. So stalking, seen a lot more technological stalking these days. So installing apps on people's phones, accessing their emails, their Facebook, their messages, the location settings on their devices. So maybe someone just continually turning up at particular places. So someone might be out for coffee with their friend, and then all of a sudden their partner, or maybe their ex-partner at the time, just walks by and maybe a couple of times, and they see them through the window of the cafe that they're in. I know that there is technology that tracks movement, and the perpetrator will get notifications for things like someone has left the house, or someone has entered into a specific financial transaction. So all of these things, keeping tabs on people. I'm seeing that it's becoming more common, and it's becoming easier to do. And I think that the scary part of it is that the people who are being tracked might not even actually be aware that that's what's going on. Okay, so I'm just going to check whether we've got any questions coming through. So I've got a million things open on my screen at the moment, but no questions coming in. Feel free to pop them in the chat as well, but just be aware that in the chat other people can see your name attached to those questions. Okay, so attempting or threatening to do any of the things that constitute a family violence offence is also a family violence offence. So that can just be the threat of assault. And sometimes you will see that if there is physical violence, the threat that might happen again, even if it has been a singular incident, that the threat that is what might happen to someone if they don't conform to the wishes of the perpetrator. There might not ever be another incident of physical violence, but just the mere threat that that could happen is enough to keep the victim in line. Economic abuse and emotional abuse are things I'm going to cover in the following slides because they are unique to our Tasmanian legislation, and I do just want to touch on those separately. But family violence offences can also be contravening what we call a police family violence order or a family violence order, and I will talk about those a little bit later in the slides as well. Property damage is something that I see, I wouldn't say quite often, but it pops up regularly. And the property damage that I think does the most harm is when it's to a rental property that might be in her sole name. And if he damages something in the property or repeatedly damages something in the property, then that can be used against her as a tenant to have her evicted. And that's something that I've seen on a number of occasions. So I guess just going back to our healthy and unhealthy relationship traits, some of those things that we talked about, disrespect, not having an equal balance of power, some of those things can be unhealthy, but they might not necessarily constitute family violence under this list that we're looking at now. However, what I tend to see is that where there are those unhealthy relationship traits, we kind of deal with it on a continuum of moving from maybe from white to black, that we might have some disrespectful behaviours to start with in a relationship, or there might be some underlying issues of unhealthy traits in a relationship. And they are really the red flags or warning signs of moving into some more problematic behaviours, I would say, and that once we sort of hit the tipping point of, coming up against some of these issues on this list, those unhealthy traits then start to become abusive and then start to become illegal under our Family Violence Act. Okay, so I just got a question coming through here. So property damage, does this only apply to actual property, i.e. a dwelling? I'm thinking of someone damaging a vehicle to disallow transport. Would that constitute property damage under the law? Absolutely. I'm really sorry I wasn't clear about that. So property damage isn't just real estate. It is damaging phones, so people can't make phone calls. It's a really great example that you've used there. The questioner has asked about damaging a car so that someone can't use the vehicle to get away or to be independent. And one of those really big tactics that we see in some coercive controlling behaviours is the social isolation. So stopping people from being able to communicate with or see people who would otherwise be supportive to them. They're really big red flags as well. So thank you for your question. I'm just going to try and get my Q&A. Yep, no other questions have come through there at the moment, so I'll move on. Okay, so just a few examples here of what some of those problematic behaviours can look like. I'll just check. Sorry, I've just got a few bits and pieces open on my screen at the moment, and I'm just having a little bit of trouble keeping tabs on where I'm up to. Okay, so sorry, I just had the chat box was covering my headline, economic abuse. So yes, this is our economic abuse slide. And the reason I wanted to talk about this specifically was because Tasmania is one of the only jurisdictions in Australia that criminalises financial or economic abuse. And the way I see it presenting, it can happen from people who receive a Centrelink benefit, people who are really might be living in poverty, might not have access to financial resources or financial support, and it can happen right at the other end of the spectrum as well. Really wealthy people, people who you would think of as quite well off, and it can happen at both ends. And what it really is a form of control. It is a way to stop someone from being able to be independent, to have contact with the people they want, to be able to see who they want, travel where they want, whether that's money for a bus ticket or putting petrol in the car, whether it's through to giving her an allowance so that you are constantly in a position where you don't have any autonomy over what happens with the money in your relationship, preventing someone from really having any meaningful input into how the money is used and allocated in a household. And I think it's really important here to distinguish as well that I'm not talking about people having arguments about what happens with their money and with their assets. Couples have disagreements about money quite often. From my understanding, it's one of those big forms of tension in relationships, and you can have disagreements about, whether you spend the money on the holiday or whether you put it towards a new car, and you can have a back and forth conversation about that. When it really tips into financial abuse, we are looking at it is being used as a tool to control the other party. And a way that it's used to control, I've seen numerous clients over the years. She'll come in, they've separated, she might have been put in a position where he's made her claim a Centrelink benefit that she knew she wasn't entitled to. So she might have been claiming a single rate through Centrelink for a parenting payment when she was actually living with her partner. And then they break up. And she might otherwise be entitled to a property settlement, but he then says, well, you know, that's fine, but if you come after me for my super or for anything out of the property pool, I'm going to dob you into Centrelink. And by that point, if it's been going on for a number of years, she might not only be facing the repayment of that debt, she might also be facing criminal prosecution. So using that as a way to control her actions and how she exercises her rights is where we're really looking at how the power imbalance in that decision making, the power imbalance in what the use of financial resources is what's the purpose of it. No questions coming through at this point. This is sometimes a tricky one. I usually get some people maybe making some comments about how money is worked out in particular relationships, but nothing coming through. Okay, we'll move on. All right, so emotional abuse is another one of those provisions that we have that is unique to Tasmanian legislation. It is probably the closest thing we have nationally to criminalising coercive control. You might have heard that there's been a bit of discussion about that over the last couple of years about whether we have a criminal offence for coercive control. Emotional abuse, while it covers some of what coercive control looks like, it doesn't go all the way to criminalising it, but it's probably some of the best legislation that we have in the country. And when we're looking at emotional abuse, what we're looking at is, controlling or intimidating behaviour that causes mental harm. It's usually something that is conducted over a course of conduct, so it's not really an isolated incident, but it can present in so many different ways. And it's really difficult to say, well, this is what emotional abuse looks like, and this is how it plays out, and this is how you can catch it, because it's really going to depend on the dynamics between the parties. But the emotional abuse that I'm just trying to think of some examples that we see a lot, lots of undermining a person's sense of self, undermining her own feelings and experiences and memories, makes her doubt herself, makes her feel like she's not worthy. I don't know how many times I can tell you people have used the words walk on eggshells, or making her feel like she's worthless. Really common theme is that just a real undermining of a sense of self, and that, another one is you'll never find anyone else. I love you, but you're pretty unlovable, so good luck out there on your own if you decide to split from me. So walking on eggshells, you'll never find anyone else, you're not really very lovable. And this pattern, it builds up over time where she comes to believe that, and therefore it's either it's being with him or being completely unloved at all. So another comment coming through: under the law, it's difficult to prove emotional abuse to a court, i.e. imagine a psych assessment would be handy, but of course not always possible. Look, the rates for prosecution of financial abuse and emotional abuse in Tasmania have historically been really low since our Family Violence Act was introduced in 2004. We might have thousands of reports of family violence every year, and that we might be talking double digits of things that actually get prosecuted for financial and emotional abuse. I also don't know of any financial abuse offences that have been prosecuted on their own, which means that there might be a number of other things going on. So there might be physical abuse or sexual assault. There might be some other form of verbal abuse, And then the financial and emotional abuse stuff can almost be tacked on. And I hate saying it like that because they are sole offences. They are able and to be prosecuted as individual offences. But we haven't historically seen that as the case. And yet the other comment coming through, it's the same for financial abuse. I think that there are some really good prosecutors within Tasmania Police and within the Director of Public Prosecution Office who are coming to know the signs of emotional abuse, and I think that there's an improvement in the last few years, especially of how we actually successfully prosecute these things. But it's taken a long time, and it's still developing, and it's about educating and working with Tasmania Police usually, so when it's been prosecuted in the Magistrates Court, of setting out how this has actually had an impact on her emotionally and financially, not just the easier prosecutions of physical abuse. If you've got bruises, if you've got medical reports, those are really tangible things. If you're trying to establish that you have completely eroded someone's sense of self, stripped away her self-worth and self-esteem, and rebuilt her in a way that she is completely under your control now, that is a lot harder to establish. It's not impossible. It is just, it's more resource intensive, and it takes a lot more work. Are there any other questions or comments coming through on that? Yeah, so someone said I was going to ask the same regarding financial abuse. What sort of evidence is needed? I.e., would someone keep a diary of events? Keeping a diary of events be useful? Yeah, I mean, legally, yes. I think that there are some safety issues regarding keeping a diary or tracking instances of family violence. The reason is that if the perpetrator finds that someone is tracking their behaviour, that can actually be a really high risk factor for future and escalating violence. So the legal answer is, yep, I love evidence. I love when someone comes in and they say, here's a whole list of emails that I've been sending myself over the last 2 years documenting the abuse that I've been receiving. Legally, beautiful, chef's kiss. But if he were to find that while they were in a relationship and potentially still cohabiting, what risk might she be exposed to because of that? So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I'd be looking at safety planning around that. So does she have a friend that can keep the information for her? Does she have a separate email account that she might be able to set up that's separate from the devices that she uses? Where can she actually keep that information in a safe way? All right. What are we up to? Okay, so coercive control. I think I've touched on this, that coercive control is, emotional abuse is part of it. Coercive control is a little bit bigger. So, but coercive control, I like to think of as encapsulating some of those other forms of psychological abuse. The gaslighting one is a really big one that I see. So making someone feel like they can't rely on their own memory. Big one is, oh, that never happened. Or I don't remember saying that. I didn't say that. When the person who's experiencing it knows that they heard him say yesterday that he was going to, drop the paperwork in for the car registration. And he said he would. And you ask him whether he's done that or not. And he says, no, I never said that I did that. And it might just be one thing, but over time, what happens and what I see happen with the women that sort of sit in front of me is that they can't rely on themselves for anything anymore. They don't think they can remember incidents. They don't think they can make a decision without consulting someone. They don't think they have the ability to know what's in their own interests because someone has always been there undermining them. And it doesn't take very long. It can happen in a really short space of time. And some of the saddest instances of it I've seen is like over decades, women will speak to me and they have no way of making decisions on their own anymore. They've been completely eroded and stripped down and are so reliant on someone telling them what they remember, what they think, what they believe, what they should feel, that they have no trust in themselves anymore. And that can take a really long time to build back up. And that is when I would look at working with other support services, rather than just dealing with their issue as a legal problem. It's a really holistic issue of looking at building up both their psychological and emotional health, as well as starting to enforce some of their legal rights. Okay. All right, so high risk factors. I just want to be really clear when I talk about risk factors, I'm not talking about causation. The only cause of family violence is a person who has decided to commit family violence. And the only cause of abuse is someone deciding they're going to be abusive. However, from the data, some of the things that we know can be an indication that violence might escalate or get worse, or that something really bad might be about to happen, are what have we got? 16, I hope I've done my maths right there, 16 risk factors that we see. So pregnancy is a big one that can sometimes surprise people. So what we can see is the perpetrator feeling a loss of control over her and her body. She might be giving more attention to someone else. So pregnancy and childbirth, her focus has shifted away from him and meeting his needs, and that can lead to an escalation in the violence. So access to weapons, strangulation or attempts to strangle, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in the next presentation that I give, but non-fatal strangulation or choking is a huge risk factor for future homicide. If I'm ever sitting with someone and they disclose anything about having been strangled or choked or had in any way their airways obstructed or suffocated, huge warning bells go off for me about the risk that she may be killed by the perpetrator of that abuse. The data suggests that there is a 7 to 8 fold increase in future homicide for victims of family violence who've experienced non-fatal strangulation than those who have experienced assault that doesn't involve non-fatal strangulation. We do have some hope on the horizon that non-fatal strangulation might be criminalised in its own offence rather than relying on the charge of assault, but that's still sort of working its way through Parliament in Tasmania at the moment. Another one that might be surprising is threats of suicide. And I think that threats of suicide do need to be taken really seriously. And I'd never say to anyone that they should brush off a threat to self-harm or suicide. But patterns do emerge. And I have seen a lot of women come in and say, he threatens to kill himself if I leave. And over time, and that being said enough, she feels like she can't leave because if anything happens to him, if he does anything to himself, then it's going to be her fault. So that's another one to watch out for. I'm just going to try and move. Oh yeah, and unemployment, threats to kill pets. I can't name the number of times over the years that that I've seen someone either threaten to or actually harm a pet or an animal in the household. Okay. No other questions coming through? All right, so now we're getting to protective orders. I'm just checking the time. Okay, we're going really well for time. So I've mentioned some of these earlier in the presentation. So I've said that a breach of a police family violence order, a family violence order is a family violence offence in and of itself. The reason that that can be helpful is that if someone is arrested for a family violence offence, there is what we call a presumption against bail, which means that the perpetrator actually has the onus of establishing that if you release me on bail, the victim of that crime is actually going to be safe. So usually the presumption is you get out on bail unless the state can establish that person is going to be a risk, but that onus is reversed in family violence offences, which, I mean, basically just makes it a little bit trickier for family violence offenders to get bail. Okay, so I've digressed a little bit. But police family violence orders, surprisingly, issued by police. So they can issue a police family violence order if they reasonably conclude that a family violence offence has taken place, or that there is a risk of a family violence offence occurring. They're pretty easy to issue by police, and they can include a number of orders, including that the perpetrator has to leave the family home, can't be within a certain distance of the victim survivor. They might include just what we call a general keep the peace order, which is that the perpetrator will not abuse, harass, threaten, assault, stalk the person to be protected. So it's, and they will always include an order that the offender has to surrender any firearms and any firearm licence that they currently hold. Now, family violence orders, very similar, but they are issued by a magistrate in court, and they can be issued if someone wants to change the terms of the police family violence order. So an offender might want to change the terms of that PFVO, and they might, if the victim doesn't consent and the police don't consent, then that offender would have to make an application to a magistrate for a magistrate to make that order. So you can also go straight to the court to make an application for an FVO, and we would generally do that in circumstances where it's unlikely the police would issue an order. I find that police are unlikely to issue an order where they don't see some kind of immediate threat or there hasn't been a recent incident. But if we have a lot of evidence that there are some high risk factors, so going back to our previous slide, there might be emotional and financial abuse, and we might want to specifically set out what that is to a magistrate for them to consider that, and that the person needs to be protected on the basis that maybe some of those risk factors have increased. A magistrate is probably the more appropriate person to consider and determine whether that person needs to be protected by an order. Right, 1 second. Really happy to receive questions, just as a reminder. All right, I had one come through. Is a DVO an old term for an FVO? I've heard the term DVO before. Yeah, okay, they're called different things all across Australia. So we in Tasmania have usually only called them, back in the old days, AVO. Yep. So I think that was apprehended violence order. There might be domestic violence orders, but they might be called those things in other states. But in Tasmania, they're PFVOs and FVOs. But we do have legislation now that nationally recognises any order that has been granted across Australia, and we have mutual legislation with all of the other states in Australia that they will recognise our PFVOs and FVOs as well. Do the orders have a time limit? Generally 12 months, so but you can get longer and you can extend them. If you want to extend an order, especially if it's a police family violence order, you are looking at having to make an application to a magistrate for them to make that decision. And that usually have to show as well that there has been breaches of the order over the term of the order, or that there is still a need for protection. You use the word victim instead of survivor when referring to someone who has experienced DV, intimate partner violence. Is that phrasing a legal norm in Tas? No, it's not. And I actually thought of this earlier. I've been interchanging the way I refer to people. So there are victim survivors. In the orders, we use the term the person to be protected. If it's a criminal proceeding, the person might be a complainant. So there are lots of different ways to refer to someone who has experienced family violence, and I apologise, I probably haven't been consistent with my terminology throughout the presentation. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. All right. I think I've already mentioned bail conditions as well, which is a nice little part of the legislation that we have that can retain a person who uses family violence, a perpetrator or the offender, depending on which part of the law you're talking about, until they can establish that their release is going to be safe for the person who's experienced violence. Okay. We're coming up to the end of the presentation now. I know we've still got quite a bit of time, so if there are any other questions to come through, I'd much rather answer them than sit here and talk to myself, which is what it can feel like on these Zoom calls sometimes. Okay, so I just wanted to bounce back to red flags, and this kind of links in with the unhealthy relationship traits that we might see that might not necessarily constitute a family violence offence, or might not necessarily be abusive, but some of these obviously are. But these are red flags that I look out for when I'm talking to people, or when I'm talking to friends about their relationships, or some red flags that I might have in looking at any particular relationship. So I spoke with a friend recently, and she had commenced a new relationship, and I said, okay, well, tell me about all the green flags. And she said, oh, what do you mean? I said, well, tell me about, we know, red flags are things that that would give you pause, make you concerned. What are the green flags? What are the healthy things in those relationships? And she went through a number of things, and I was like, yep, tick, 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 that's great. But some of the red flags here might not necessarily jump to mind that they might be unhealthy or that they might be abusive. One of the ones I hear is jealousy. So sometimes people think that jealousy can mean that someone is just really into them, that they're really, they love me so much that they just want to know that I'm, where I am. They want to make sure I'm safe. They want to make sure that I'm not seeing anybody else. But that is actually a really early red flag for controlling behaviours. So if someone is really jealous, or even just mildly jealous, the person who's experiencing that might start to regulate their own behaviour to prevent that person from becoming jealous in the first place. And they might start doing that without even realising it. And that's the same for overly affectionate early in the relationship. I'm not sure whether anyone has heard the term love bombing, but that's when really early on in a relationship, someone just becomes really intensely enamoured with you. They tell you all the time, they fall in love with you really quickly, they might buy you gifts, they might want to spend all their time with you. And what that can do is start to isolate you from other people really quickly. So that's a red flag that I look out for, because isolation, as we know, is a really difficult thing for someone to seek support later on in the relationship if they've been cut off from all of the people that they would otherwise turn to for advice or help. Okay, so we've just got a couple of other comments coming through. Thank you. Do you know if, lots of questions. Great. Okay, I've just got to scroll back up. So do you know if the police undergo any training regarding recognising or helping people who've experienced domestic violence, intimate partner violence? They do. I don't know how extensive it is. We are working on how much more education they might need, and I know that there is a special family violence unit within police that we try and liaise with if we've got issues with people, and I know that the family violence unit has a really great understanding of family violence dynamics, but I think there is still work to do. especially in relation to the emotional abuse and financial abuse aspects of family violence. What we can see is that police might be really good at responding to an incident of violence. So they might be called out by someone within the household or by a neighbour who hears yelling, and they come and they say, okay, well, we've got someone who's, you know, been really verbally abusive and aggressive, but the other party has been doing that as well. And there might be an admission made by one or both parties. Yeah, look, I smashed his beer bottles because I wanted him to stop drinking. And we have seen that then can lead to the woman in that situation having a police family violence order issued against her because she's made an admission about a particular incident that does tick a box for family violence. She's damaged his property. But what that fails to take into account when we zoom out is, what are the patterns of behaviour here? Who holds the power in that relationship? If someone is exercising power over someone else, if someone is exhibiting controlling behaviours, if someone is presenting to police in a really calm, measured manner, then that can lead to the misidentification of who the predominant perpetrator of the violence is. And I think that's probably where we need more education when it comes to policing. Okay. Just scrolling down again, just give me 1 second to read these as I go through. Might have missed this from the first part of the session. I was understanding that domestic violence orders, family violence order, or family violence orders couldn't be issued unless the couple were recognised as a couple, i.e. married or de facto. So family violence orders couldn't be issued if there were on-off partners, had a history of sexual relationship together, but were not partners at the time. So I did mention this really briefly at the start. You do have to be in a significant relationship or have been in a significant relationship under our Act. Whether you have or have not been in a significant relationship can be tricky to establish. If the police refuse to issue a police family violence order on the basis that they don't think there is a significant relationship, you do have the option of making an application to the court for a magistrate to determine that. And that's when we would look at making an application for the family violence order, put the evidence before the magistrate and ask his or her honour to make an order on the basis that, yes, there was a significant relationship because of this, this and this factor. And there is an act that we can go to work out whether someone is in a significant relationship or not. Okay, would you consider unwillingness to grow as a person or do the work a red flag? Oh, absolutely. When I was talking to my friend and she was listing all of her green flags about the person that she was just starting to see, she mentioned that he was in therapy, and I went, tick. So emotionally aware, someone who is working on himself, has an understanding of his own issues. Perfect green flag, I think. Are there any resources or training that you can recommend that have a TAS disabilities focus? Oh, I know the person who's asked that question. I might have a think about that and get back to you. But if there's anyone else interested in that, I understand where you're coming from, and I think that there can be really high rates with women who have a disability, especially with sexual violence and sexual abuse as well. So I'm going to have a think about that and get back to you. So thanks for asking that question. You know who you are. I thought this was an imperative part of the work. Oh, I think that might be responding to a previous comment. Another question related to the structure of family recognised under a family violence order. Can family violence orders be relevant? Oh, sorry. Just when people make new comments, my screen shifts. Sorry, and I've lost the question. Can family violence orders be relevant to people with a disability living in group homes, i.e. living in a home with the same family for 20 plus years? Oh, I'm not sure I understand If the parties, and forgive me if I'm not answering this question correctly, I'm not sure I'm fully understand what you mean, but I'll try. If people are not married or in a significant relationship, or have been married or in a significant relationship, they're not covered by the Family Violence Act. It doesn't mean they can't have other orders put in place, and that's when we look at making applications for restraint orders, which falls under a different act. It's under our Justices Act, but there are some more stringent things you have to establish to get a restraint order rather than a family violence order. I'm really sorry, I'm not sure if that answers the question. Comment, the police have a long way to go regarding trauma-informed support. I absolutely do not disagree with that. All right, so thanks for all of those comments. That's really great. I feel much more at ease answering questions than just going through the slides. So I appreciate everyone who's asked a question. Okay. Oh, well, we've jumped ahead. We don't have anything that's come through on the Q&A. Everything seems to have happened on the chat, which I'm really happy about. All right, I might just mention that if people want to know more about how they might be able to respond to things that they see in their work with their clients or patients, this Mentors in Violence Prevention workshop is run as a collection between a number of women's organisations in Tasmania, including mine at the Women's Legal Service and Women's Health Tasmania. I've done it. I went to it thinking, oh, I'm not sure that there's much they can tell me about how to do work in this space, and I was blown away because it's really facilitative, lots of discussions, lots of people's ideas, and highly recommend getting along to one of these sessions if you can. I'm going to leave the advice and referral information up just while I answer a couple of questions. Okay, no, just I think we had one more come through. I've heard a number of men claim that there is no acknowledgement of DV perpetrated by women. One man recently told me he went to the police, not sure what occurred to make that happen, but that the police laughed at him. Oh, I am really sorry to hear that. I did acknowledge and do acknowledge that family violence does occur between different genders, and that men can definitely experience family violence. I guess my response to that, first of all, I am really sorry that that person has received what looks like a completely inadequate response from police. Going back to the data and looking at who's likely to experience family violence, because it is based in power and control and an entitlement to have power and control over someone else. Unfortunately, with the gender roles and norms that we see in society, that can tend to present as men over women. And I know that I've been working in this space for a really long time, and that is the power play that I see most of all. But I do absolutely acknowledge that this is a problem amongst different genders and within LGBTIQ plus relationships as well. And that those power imbalances can play out really differently in different relationships. Okay. Any tips regarding navigating family violence that occur when the perpetrator also is in a caregiver role in chronic health condition? Yeah, look, there are lots of practical things that prevent people from being able to end relationships or walk away from relationships that they're in. I've seen both scenarios play out where the woman might have a disability and her perpetrator is actually her carer as well. I've seen it in different gendered relationships as well. I think my advice for that would be to attempt to obtain some advice from one of the counselling services, or maybe the Family Violence Counselling and Referral Service. They can do safety planning around if someone is making a decision to leave a relationship, or to obtain some legal advice specifically in relation to a situation like that. It really does require some specific tailored safety planning and risk assessment. What are the rates of incidences of domestic violence, intimate partner violence versus rates of charges laid versus rates of prosecution in the state? Oh, tough question off the top of my head. I think that the short answer is low, but I don't have it. I don't have the data with me. I'm really sorry. I do know that rates of prosecution for, like I said, those family, the financial abuse, emotional abuse offences are incredibly low. So I think we had some data, it's a few years old now, that looked at, there might be 3,500 complaints of family violence made to Tas Police every year. And we had data to suggest that there were 92 convictions for financial abuse since the commencement of the Act in 2004. So yeah, okay, thanks, Joe. I'm getting a reminder from Joe to wind up. So we've got 4 minutes left. I might just close my screen so we can all come back. But I've got the chat function still open. Yeah, I'm not sure I answered that question very well, sorry. But yeah, we might look at wrapping up then, Joe.
Yeah, look, Elise, thank you so much. It was such an informative discussion, and the questions did come flying in at the end. I think people were listening in the first part. So I just wanted to say how grateful we are to Elise and her colleagues at Women's Legal for the work they do. They're a really important part of the response to family violence here in Tasmania, and they're certainly a very, very important part of our referral network. In our next webinar with them, we'll be talking about the difficult topics of reproductive coercion and non-fatal strangulation and where the law stands on those issues. That will be in April next year, so keep your eye out for that. You can follow Women's Health Tasmania and Women's Legal Service on Facebook, both of us, so, you know, like us and follow us. If you'd like to learn more about Women's Health Tasmania, you can also sign up to our e-news, and you can do that via our website. And I'd also encourage you to check out Women's Legal Services website. They've got terrific podcasts on the topic of family violence. So as I said, a recording of this event and Elise's slide will be on our website early next week. Are you putting them on your website too, Elise?
No, is the short answer, Joe. They'll just go with the...
No worries. So come to us, guys. It'll be on our website. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your wonderful questions. You really... you know, brought out a lot of really interesting issues. And thank you again, Elise, for a terrific presentation. So.
Thanks, Joe. And thank you so much for the questions. I really love interacting. So, yeah, thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.